So we've just run through a couple of different options that you should be considering before you consider armed escorts. And hopefully a few of them jump out at you, that you do a risk assessment, that you do conclude that a number of them will work for your situation. But if you do still conclude that armed escorts need to be used as a last resort, there are still a few different criteria that you must meet in order to consider them as an option. According to the guidelines, there are 4 essential criteria that you have to meet in order to consider armed escorts as a last resort. I'll mention them here briefly and then we'll go look at them in further detail. First, we have the criteria of humanitarian need and program criticality. This states that if you weren't able to go at all, if you were not able to deliver assistance, there would be unacceptable human suffering. It also stipulates that the only way you can deliver that assistance is through the use of armed escorts. Next, we have the criterion of responsible authorities, which declares that state or non-state actors are going to be unwilling to permit the movement of humanitarian personnel or supplies unless we use an armed escort. Next, we have the criterion of safety and security. And this criterion is filled when we know that the armed escort provider is going to provide a credible deterrent against attack, which literally means their very presence is going to discourage others from attacking the convoy. Also, we need to know that their presence is not going to compromise the safety and security of the population in need. The final criterion is sustainability, which says that we know for a fact armed escorts will not compromise the operating environment for humanitarian organizations in the future. In order to fulfill this criterion, it's important that any agency considering the use of armed escorts undertakes a thorough stakeholder analysis that helps them to identify the potential negative consequences of using armed escorts. They then should identify any kind of mitigation measure necessary and put it in place to reduce those negative consequences. So now you have the 4 criterion that have to be in place in order for you to justify the use of armed escorts for humanitarian convoys. We're going to look at each one of them in detail, but before we do that, I want to highlight what I think is one of the most important caveats included at this point in the document. Take a moment to read through this statement. If you notice here, we're talking about a specific time frame, a specific geographic location, and a specific humanitarian purpose. We haven't mentioned this before, but it's important that we do at this point. Because when you're thinking about using armed escorts, it is unacceptable to start using them without an end date in mind. It's unacceptable to think about using them in general. The authors go into greater detail about this when they get to the section on exit strategies. But they wanted to put this up front so you have that in your mind when you start to think about whether or not you want to use them. Now that we've covered this caveat, let's take a look at these 4 criteria that we mentioned before.